Tuesday, August 5th, 2014, meeting of the Township of South Orange Village Board of Adjustment. May we have a roll call?
Yes, Mr. Don.
Here.
Mrs. DeScalo.
Here.
Mr. Reeves.
Here.
Mr. Adler.
Here.
And Mrs. Shapiro.
Here. Pursuant to Section 5, Chapter 231, PL 1975, this is to state for the record that adequate notice of this meeting is provided to the public by posting and maintaining the annual notice of regular meetings on the bulletin board in Village Hall, by publishing the annual notice of regular meetings for 2014 in the December 2013 edition of the South Orange Maplewood News Record, and by filing said notice in the office of the village clerk. Okay, so the first order of business tonight is the approval of resolution case 1014 Seton Hall University, otherwise known as Ora Manor. So
Chairman, there were some changes made to this. I believe the board has gotten copies of the red line changes in
Yes.
paragraphs 3 and...
right.
Yes.
I didn't get, or I didn't see it. Can I just see that?
Paragraph 3, 20, and 20, I know there's a...
Okay.
I'm looking at them
That's
now.
correct.
Page 5. That were made, those changes were made pursuant to the board's comments?
Yes,
I think that was a nice resolution with those changes.
Yeah. I
And
agree.
I move to adopt it.
I'll second.
Okay, Mr. Adler.
Yes.
Mr. Don.
Yes.
Mr. DeScalo.
Yes.
Mr. Reeves.
Yes.
And Mrs. Shapiro.
Yes.
And now, it's not listed here, but we have minutes for June 3rd. Are these to be approved this evening?
Yeah.
Okay, it wasn't on the agenda, but I assume...
Yeah, it is above the resolution.
I must have an old... Oh, it's in the new one here. Okay, all right. My apologies. Okay. Actually, no, I don't see it.
It's right here.
So this is a new one, right. Okay, so this is for the minutes, yeah, for the June meeting, June 3rd, 2014, approval of the minutes. So there are a number of suggested changes to these minutes. I see them highlighted in red. I appreciate the work that was done by the members on looking at this. Does anybody have any comments about the minutes or the changes?
No, I think that Mr. Adler picked up a lot of good items, and I went through at his request and so just cleaned up some items in the architectural testimony, and I think it's a pretty good reflection now of what went on at the meeting.
Now, Mr. Adler had a separate email that you wanted to add something yet in there.
Yeah, I figured it wasn't necessary.
Okay, all right. Okay, so do we have any comments about the minutes with these corrections, additions in them? Anybody want to make a motion to accept?
I'll move that we approve these minutes as amended.
I'll second.
Okay, Mr. DeScalo.
Yes.
Mr. Don.
Yes.
Mr. Reeves.
Yes.
Mr. Adler.
Yes.
And Mrs. Shapiro.
Yes.
Okay, so now we start to get into the matters at hand. The first item that we'll hear this evening is an application for completeness. Case 1015, New Singular Wireless. This is at 76 South Orange Avenue. In this case, our usual planner, Hire Gruhl, and Ms. Gruhl is not going to be offering the planning comments because of a conflict of interest, but our engineering firm is also a planning firm, and they're going to offer the comments on this, Omlin is, on this particular application for completeness. Go ahead.
Good evening. Christopher Quinn, for the record, with Firm Pinellas Halpern, here on behalf of the applicant, New Singular Wireless, PCS, which marketplace known as AT&T. This particular application is seeking a new telecommunications facility on 76 South Orange Avenue, the location of the temporary municipal services the building with the temporary town hall on it, within it. There's a number of other carriers that are already located on this rooftop. AT&T is proposing its equipment and its antennas on the roof concealed behind screening. We have your review letter from Online Engineering dated July 31st, 2014. There were 4 issues, number of items that they asked to provide, some of which they said we should provide as a function of our final application or final plans. A couple other items that it had asked us to provide immediately. And I just want to go through them right now because I think a couple of those items warranted discussion. I had a conversation with Mr. Keller yesterday, and some of the items we had talked about previously were discussed with the village engineer as well. But there was 3 items, that were requested right now before we could be deemed complete to proceed. First one is that the property in question, we labeled it as Lot 4 and or 6 on our application, and I think what happened here was that the building itself is on what was Lot 6, and adjacent to Lot 6 was a sidewalk, and that was Lot 4. They've been subsequently consolidated and merged into one Lot 4. However, the tax maps are still old, so to clear everything up, we were told to write Lots 4 and 6 and include both on our application. I think the appropriate way to do it, to revise everything, our plans and application, would be to change it to Lot 4, and then in parentheses, formally Lots 4 and 6. I think that kind of covers the small basis. And I don't think I don't know if there's any objection from the engineer for us to do that.
That's fine.
Yeah, I looked at that, and yeah, it was the sidewalk and then the main building lot, so.
Sure.
Yes.
And I mean, I noticed yesterday, even the 200-foot property list we got from the tax assessor was incorrect. It only gave us for that sidewalk lot, so I had to call them up and ask them for a new list so we could notice everyone when we actually get to the hearing phase. The second item was for a boundary survey.
Wait a second. The planner doesn't approve, we approve. We have, I'm okay with that, it makes clarification of putting it in parentheses, formerly Lots 4 and 6. I looked at the map, and it makes sense. Okay, go ahead, keep going.
Okay, great. The second item was for a boundary survey, and again, this is a building that's been fully developed. We're not proposing any ground disturbance. There's a number of other telecommunications carriers that are already on this roof, and we're submitting plans, I think, were similar to the scope of what they've done. We've done a cell site survey, which we believe would adequately provide what's there on the property and the setbacks and how it sits on the property. I'd ask for a waiver of that requirement because, again, we're not doing any ground disturbance whatsoever. It's just a rooftop facility.
Okay. And the planner's objection was?
Just that it's not a property survey. It's not a full boundary.
It is not a boundary survey that's required by checklist. However, they are asking for a front yard setback variance. That is an existing condition. However, it's not labeled a distance. There's no known distance since there's not a boundary survey to what this front yard setback condition is. If the board wishes to waive it, that would be fine as long as the applicant agrees not to exacerbate the existing condition.
Sure. Again, its antenna's on the rooftop, so it's everything's contained within the building itself and the building footprint.
So the front yard here is considered what, Valley or South Orange Avenue?
It's both.
Doors on South Orange, right?
Because I guess depending on this Lot 4, Lot 6 issue, I guess if Lot 4 has been consolidated, then there is a front yard on Valley, because Lot 4 is the space between the front of the building and the sidewalk.
No, I mean, I look at it saying that considering it's all consolidated now, we have front yards on Valley Street, South Orange Avenue, Irvington Avenue, and Academy.
Is Lot 5 part of the property?
No,
too?
it's not.
No.
No, and in fact, I think that's owned by the village.
Okay.
So do we want them to provide a boundary survey in consideration of the front yard setback, even though the modification is going to be on the rooftop?
I mean, we can revise our plans to show what the setback is, so that way it's clear to everyone what the setback is of the existing building and what it will be for our facility.
Okay, so
I mean, I think that would clearly show.
Why don't you do that and show that to us before the next hearing?
Sure.
Can you do that?
And I would say that on your zoning table, it does note the front yard existing as 0, which is not correct. On your sheet Z-2, Your zoning table?
It's correct with respect to, I guess you're right, yeah, at this point now it's, since the lots are consolidated, it would be the setback from the building to Valley and the building to Academy, which looks like it's a little bit larger than, it'll be a few feet.
Right.
We'll revise that again. That's part of the change, we change over our application to show that we'll correct all the setbacks.
Okay, great.
So they have 4 front yards, so they have to provide 4 front setback numbers.
I suppose so.
Well, we've done this before. We'll provide on the plan, so it shows front yard setback to Valley, front yard setback to Academy as necessary.
Okay.
It'll be clear.
Okay. So that will be provided before the final materials for the
Sure.
actual application. Okay. Number 3, shall we move on?
Yes. Number 3 was asking for a disclosure statement provided for the property owner. Normally, that's not required pursuant to the MLUL. It's required for disclosure of the applicant, any corporate ownership interest for the applicant, which we've provided. In this case, we're a tenant here. And in fact, your checklist, I think your checklist says that you fill out a form that's attached, and the form actually doesn't ask for that item number 8, which is item number 8 of your site plan checklist. And it says, ownership disclosure form, see attachment, an affidavit. And the attached affidavit to your checklist says, doesn't require us to provide the corporate ownership for the property, it requires us to provide the corporate ownership for the applicant.
You're looking at MLUL 48?
Well, the MLUL doesn't require it, it requires it for the applicant itself, not for the landlord.
You're talking about MLUL 48?
Yes, but I'm also talking about checklist item number 8 as well. It asks you to fill out an attached form which is completed, and the corporate ownership information required in that form is for the applicant, not for the property owner. So I submit that what we submitted was complies with what the requirements for submission here.
Chuck?
I would have to, I read the ordinance, I read the MLUL, I also looked at Cox, the interpretation, and it wasn't clear that it specifically did not include the owner, the way I had read it. I would defer to Mr. Dwyer on that.
Sure, I mean, the MLUL, there's actually a contemplated amendment to the MLUL a couple of years ago to include the requirement for a property owner to give their any corporate information as well, but that was never adopted. That was never expressly adopted into the MLUL.
You've had that owner before the board, have
You need to speak in the microphone. We've had the owner before the
you not?
board?
That owner has been
70
before the board, haven't you?
76 South Orange? I don't.
We've had applications there, I don't.
I don't think it's, to be honest with you, I don't think it's crucial for this application. And I would say that, looking at MLUL 48-1, that it could be very well interpreted, it's only for the applicant, not the owner.
Okay. Anybody have any concerns about this, Mr. Adler?
Nope.
Okay. All right, so we're going to accept the applicant's argument in this particular case for that item. So that's item 3. Did you have other items you wish to discuss?
There were like other minor comments or changes that they had asked for in the review letter, the majority of which we're going to provide. It kind of almost goes in hand in hand with what we discussed before. We adding the setback requirements here, showing this where the nearest residential properties are, which will provide in revised
Well,
plans.
what I usually do here is, and it doesn't take that much time, is just march down these items quickly and make sure that the board members don't object. And if you're going to provide the things, you just say, we'll
Sure.
provide it.
Happy to
Okay.
do that.
All right, so let's just, why don't we just march down here? Item number 5,
It's asking us for our official 200-foot property owners list, which we just got a revised one this afternoon, so I can provide that.
okay, so that will be provided.
Number 6 is deed and affidavit title, which we've asked for a waiver for.
Okay, that's, and I'm waiting here, if you all have any objections or questions, pipe up, okay? Okay.
Item number 8 is the owner disclosure affidavit, which I just talked
Right.
about before. Item number 5 is to providing our affidavit of notice for the public hearing, which we'll provide, obviously, before the actual hearing. We do give notice to the public. Number 10 is our utility letters, which again, it's an existing building. We're tying into the electric. We're going to have our own service. We're not anticipating any problems here. We can provide as a conditional approval if necessary.
Okay, yes.
Number 12, Essex County Health Department application. Again, there's no septic, nothing, no other types of utilities, just gas, electric, just electric and telco here. There's no habitation for this facility. Number 13, Soil Conservation District application, and one's not required. 14 is DOT or DEP approvals, they're not required as well. 15 is digital copies of the site plan, which we can provide as condition of approval. 16 is the final site plan, and again, we'll provide that as a condition of our approval. We're requesting preliminary final site plan approval for this application, so the plans that we submit will ultimately be our final site plans. 17 is environmental impact assessment. Again, the property's already developed. This is just going to be, I think, third or fourth carried on the document. So we request a waiver of that. Item number 18 is talking about our photo simulation or visual analysis that we've submitted as part of this application. Those were prepared by a licensed planner, and that planner will be at the hearing to testify to those. So they can certainly authenticate them during the course of their testimony at the hearing. I think that was a good question raised up as
Right.
Who prepared those. Item number 19 was a traffic and parking assessment, but again, it's an unmanned telecommunications. We generally don't have to do with traffic and parking. 21, an engineer's cost estimate. We ask for a waiver. We're only proposing our own facilities. One's required afterwards is provided. Generally, we don't have to do it because we're not proposing anything except for our own.
Do we even require that as a condition of approval? Is that, I mean, what do we care about the particular estimate? I don't think we've ever required that. Okay.
25 is talking about the survey map and showing the lot and block number on the property. We're going to, again, make the revisions we discussed before.
So that will be provided.
And it would be provided, again, it wouldn't be a survey, it would be our cell site survey that we provided as part of the initial submission. Item number 26 is asking us to place the telephone number of the applicant on the plans. We will do that.
Okay.
Are you going to provide information also about the property owner?
Sure, we'll provide them.
Because you're going to be the applicant, but they're still an owner.
Yeah, of course. 32 is again with the boundary survey, which we discussed. We're seeking a waiver for. 33 is the setback lines, which again we'll provide on our plans when we resubmit. Item 35 is talking about existing critical environmental areas, and again, sites currently developed, so we're requesting a waiver for that. Wells or septic for number 37 within 100 feet of the property. Again, waiver, it's a rooftop facility, no impact on that. Item 38 is the landscaping plan. It's a waiver, there's no landscaping in the area. 42, approve of all other federal, state, county, and local permits and approvals. We request a waiver this time. We filed our county application. There's no other required besides the municipal approvals that we have to obtain.
I think, do we have that? I think we have that.
Do you have a copy of our application that was filed to the county?
Right.
We have not received our approval at this point. We expect it in the next couple of weeks.
We typically make that a
Condition of approval, right. Okay.
Item number 43 just says they take no exception to the as a condition of approval.
I'm looking for it.
Checklist item is.
Where's our checklist?
show utility connections.
Utility systems. Show utility connections, again, it's an existing building, it's already constructed, so it's tying into the existing electric. 44, show the location, use of all structure within 200 feet of the property, and the location of residential use within 200 feet of our property. We'll provide that.
All right, that's a good one.
No,
That was the
actually,
one,
I agree.
Well, I have a question on that.
that was my main objection to any of this, was item 44. So this will be, again, provided before your actual hearing, right?
Yes.
I have a question on that, Russ.
Yeah, go ahead.
Why do you want to limit this to residential uses?
That's what your board engineer requested us to do. That wasn't our letter, they asked us to provide that information, we said we provided, if you want us to provide.
As opposed to all uses, just residential
If you
uses?
prefer this, we provide all uses, we can do that.
Yeah, why don't you just
Okay.
label what they
Sure.
all are?
You just label what they are.
That's fine. Again, it wasn't. Item number 45, again, it's asking for building setbacks, which we'll provide. 46, only one building elevation provided, we'll provide additional building elevations. Uh, 47, solid waste removal and recycling, it's not applicable for this application. 49, the right-of-way with streets, no easement shown on the subject property. There's nothing that impacts this application for any easements that impact you. So it's a rooftop facility, there's really no issues with easements that affect our property. 50, topographic survey, again, it's a waiver request, similar to the other survey. Grading plan, again, same thing, doesn't really apply here, we're not doing any grading work or land disturbance. Same thing with 52, stormwater management. 53, circulation plan. 54, parking calculation.
Okay, wait, okay.
I'm sorry, a lot of this just doesn't apply to this type of
Okay,
application.
yes, say don't apply then. You know.
Okay,
We're not so bright up here. Just, you're doing fine, all right. So 53 doesn't apply.
53 does not apply.
Okay.
54 is asking for parking calculations, and that does not apply.
Okay,
55 is a lighting plan, and that does not apply because we're not proposing any lighting. 56 is a signage plan, again, that doesn't apply, we're not
okay,
proposing
wait,
any
let's,
signage.
you're not putting any lighting up in these structures that you're building up there?
No.
There's no lights, so when if you're working on it at night or?
If they bring a night, the technician will have a flashlight with them.
Okay, okay. 56.
56 is signage plan. So again, there's no advertising or anything proposed here. 57 is soil erosion sediment control plan, and again, doesn't apply because there's no ground disturbance. 59 is engineer saying, talking about the final plat conforms to the preliminary plat. Since we're requesting preliminary and final simultaneously, I'd submit that doesn't apply here either. And item 60 is asking for soil logs, which again, it's no ground disturbance, so it doesn't apply.
Do we have any comments about any of these items?
Just have one question.
Okay,
Not dealing with these.
okay, Mr. Don.
So the variance you're asking for deals only with the height?
It's use and height, because it's not permitted anywhere in the village.
Right.
So I think any application for a telecommunications facility has to go in front of this board.
Okay. But the fact that you're building these two enclosures up higher,
A little bit, yeah, they're a little bit higher than what they're existing and exceeds, especially how the topography exists
Okay.
within the site. I think that also triggers the height.
And I'm just anticipating what's happened in the past with residents might come up and be worried about radio frequencies. And that's where it's important to show where there might be any residential properties within 200 feet and what,
and a translation of this report.
Sure.
you know, yeah, and what the radio frequency intensity would be within, at that 200 feet if there's residential.
Certainly, that's all. We usually have someone to come testify, so especially if there's ever a question with residents, we always make sure we have someone. Primarily, the board knows that, you know, once you say you comply, the board's hands are tied, but at the same time, we always like to bring someone because it makes neighbors feel at ease,
Right.
and it helps explain to them.
Any other comments?
Mr. Chairman, I just ask that the applicant provide a signature by the applicant, not the attorney,
And where would that signature be?
on the application form.
Okay. Sure. And so we want to schedule this for a hearing. We've got Seton Hall in September coming up. Seton Hall is going to take up the entire evening, I guarantee you. Sure. And it might even go beyond September. I hope not, but it might. So you can request a special meeting if there's available time here. We can look into it. We've done that in the past to try to accommodate an applicant depending upon,
Sure. I mean, I
alacrity.
would certainly prefer to have a special meeting if they can be heard before that. Well, if not, at the very last date, we'll obviously take the October date, but special meeting would certainly be preferable.
So are there, Jetta, maybe you can work with the applicant about dates that they're available. You can give our secretary dates where the applicant and the professionals would be available. And I'm just telling you, there's limited days here that's so packed.
No, I understand. That's what it's, I've lived in Maplewood for 7 years. I very well understand that.
But we'll try to accommodate you.
Thank you very much.
All right, so we're going to be looking for a special meeting for them. And I'm not even guaranteeing you first on for October, because if Seton Hall goes into October, they're going first.
We understand.
So we'll see when we get a special meeting. We need to discuss anything else?
About this one?
Yeah. I think we're done. Okay, very good. So we deem the application complete then? Correct. Subject to the various conditions that we've discussed.
Whatever materials still need to submit in advance, please do so 2 weeks in advance.
Yeah, 2 weeks in advance. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Okay.
Susan Gruhl, come on down.
Okay, so then we move on now. I'll just mention here that Seton Hall is carried to September's meeting, so they won't be heard this evening. The next application is an appeal from the Historic Preservation Commission. This is Luther and Hazel Turner at 14 Kigman Road. Would you come forward, please? Thank you, appreciate it.
Swapping planners.
Yes, let the record reflect that Ms. Gruhl is now assuming the role as the planner for this next application, for the Turner application. Hi.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
Lisa Hendricks Richardson for the applicant and appellate, Luther and Hazel Turner. Before we begin, I'd like to ask the Vice Chairman his relationship with Amy Don, who's a commissioner on the Historic Preservation Commission.
My wife.
And is there a conflict to hear this appeal based on that relationship?
You're asking me?
I'm asking counsel.
If there is, we don't have a quorum.
Excuse me?
Oh, yes, we would still have a quorum.
Yeah, we'd still have a quorum.
It's close enough to be gray. So in that instance, I always ask if that board member would step down.
Early night.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. I have a question for you. Is it going to become a regular thing? I mean, for anything anything that comes back to us from,
I think if it's an appeal,
okay.
but not on the advisories.
Okay.
See you in September.
Sounds like-
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I believe you have before you my April 23rd, 2014 appeal, along with certain exhibits that were presented before the Historic Preservation Commission, which included the application for certificate of appropriateness, the Planning Board and Zoning Board application form, the site plans, and the deeds that were entered into the record concerning the whether or not there were any restrictions or covenants, and also a rendering of a proposed dwelling. Basically, I could restate some of my points in my letter, but this appeal is based on the procedural deficiencies and insufficient analysis of the facts presented at the HPC's, or the Historic Preservation Commission's, hearings held on November 18, 2013, December 16, 2013, and January 28, 2014, resulting in the HPC's arbitrary and capricious and unreasonable decision to deny the certificate of appropriateness. Based on the record, it appears that the HPC is a newly created body which appeared to have limited knowledge and experience with its role and statutory responsibilities, which had a deleterious effect on the review of my client's application. This was also compounded by the township's apparent lack of processes which would reconcile or complement the Central Planning Board and the Historic Preservation Commission's review processes efficiently and cost-effectively. You will note there was no checklist provided or available at the time of my client's application to the Historic Preservation Commission. Notwithstanding is my belief that we probably should not have gone before the Historic Preservation Commission, because you have two conflicting ordinances, which was ordinance number 2012-09, which indicated that a certificate of appropriateness would be required for a subdivision, yet in Section 3 of Ordinance 2016, it specifically states that only key contributing properties within the historic district identified as such shall be considered designated historical local landmarks, subject to the certificate of appropriateness provisions of Ordinance 2012-09 and any amendments thereto. The property at 14 Kingman Road has been designated a contributing property and not a key property, and your Schedule A provided in the ordinance does not list the property as a key element. One of the concerns we had with regard to the processes is that had my client been aware that the historical designation had been the historical designation been readily available to the applicant and to myself as counsel and to her surveyor, the implication of such designation apparently, earlier on in the process, she might have decided not to make the application at all. This has been a very costly application, not only fees to the Central Planning Board, but fees to the Historic Preservation Commission, as well as fees to your planner for reviewing the applications and deeming it complete for the purposes of the Historic Preservation Review. In a factual note, the application itself it was a request to subdivide the lots into two lots in which a new dwelling would be constructed on lot, what's been termed as Lot 102. The variances sought was somewhat minor, and that had to do with bulk variances. For example, Lot 1.01, which is the primary lot, in which the existing dwelling exists. Lot 101 requires a variance for a minimum lot width corner, South Orange Avenue, where the code requires 140 feet and 116.56 feet was proposed. The second variance for Lot 102 requires a variance for a minimum lot width interior. The code requires 140 feet and 80 feet is proposed. In every other dimension, the two proposed lots greatly exceed the minimum zoning code requirements for the A75 district. The proposed two lots areas continue to be very generous. Lot 1.01 would be approximately 19,177 square feet, and Lot 1.02 would be approximately 13,202 square feet, where the code requires a minimum of 7,500 square feet. It should also be noted that there is no specific land code as it pertains to the Montrose Park Historic District, which would designate possibly different bulk requirements. So my client, and I guess any other applicant, should only be held to the requirements espoused in the A75 district, or for the A75 district. During the hearings, my client was required and requested to present a chain of title to determine if there were any restrictive covenants that would prohibit subdivision of this lot, or any reference to the so-called intent or purpose that was espoused in the resolution, yet there's no documentation as to the intent and purpose of the Montrose Park District, Historic District. That's available to me as an attorney or to an applicant in a similar situation. And we presented those deeds, several deeds, to show that there was in fact no such restriction or covenant prohibiting any such subdivision, or which restricted the lot, one dwelling to a sizable lot, as again espoused throughout the hearings by the commissioners. Okay, yet nothing was provided as to historic documentation in either their application for historical designation or preservation designation, either on the federal or state level. In reviewing the commissioner's resolution, it's devoid of any rational reason as to the decision. Basically, again, they relied on my client's lack, quote unquote, of not providing a plan for the proposed dwelling. We had submitted a rendering of a possible dwelling. It was not dimensional. My client testified that she would be subject to the village's design requirements. And then the commission was also advised by council that under this subdivision application, such a site plan or architectural drawing is not required for a subdivision application. Yet the commissioners seem fixated on the lack of such a architectural drawing, which involved dimensions for the property or the proposed dwelling, which included their consternation with regard to the footprint or the proposed footprint on the site plan. You'll note in the plans that I provided for you, there was a sizable square or rectangular property or site on the site plan, in which is proposed that's where the dwelling would sit. And again, my client articulated that it was her intent to build a smaller dwelling within that footprint. So again, despite the fact that no architectural plan or site plan was required for the minor subdivision application and therefore not provided, the Commissioners' discussions as evidenced by their comments and questions concerning the architectural style and size of the proposed dwelling and where it would be situated on the new lot was the primary basis for the Historic Preservation Commission's decision to deny the certificate of appropriateness. This despite the applicant's testimony that she was not committed to the style depicted in the rendering. The Historic Preservation Commission also failed, despite the several requests, well, the somewhat urgency in providing the deeds to check the chain of title and any believed restrictions or covenants, they gave a cursory comment to that in the resolution, but again, they gave it no weight at all in their decision-making.
Counsel, excuse me 1 minute. There was one deed that was illegible. Did that ever get straightened out?
Yes. In fact, what you should have in your packet the legible deed. 'Cause
Right,
it was,
but I mean,
it was enlarged.
was a legible,
Provided?
yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Again, the commissioners seem to rely on some intent and purpose of the district, which was never articulated or provided for in any ordinance with regard to zoning requirements, whether for general zoning requirements or specific to this Montrose Park district, historic district. So again, the public, my client, myself have no indication what the intent and purpose of the district is, other than the commissioners articulating it without some supporting documentation. And so my question in my appeal was, how are applicants going before this township's land use boards and or commissions to ascertain what are permitted zoning and land uses that are not codified in its existing zoning ordinances or regulations? So again, we believe that the commissioners, in light of the newness of the commission, the newness of the ordinances, I believe we were the first, if we were the second, if not the first applicant before the Historic Preservation Commission. Again, in hindsight, we probably should not have been before them, given the fact that your ordinance 2012-16 indicates that's only applicable to key properties within the historic district. Notwithstanding, we went through the process of going before the Historic Preservation Commission. We're not satisfied that they adequately looked at all the facts presented to them. They relied on the public comments of 2 citizens opposing it, the application, but again, without any basis of factual information. And then each time, counsel for the applicant countered their position. For example, Mr. O'Leary, just pretty much mentioned his opposition, feeling that first of all, that he didn't receive adequate notice, but then that was a colloquial between him and the board counsel that it was not required in this case. Notice will be granted when and if it went before the Central Planning Board. He also raised concerns and is articulated, again, without any basis, that it was his belief that there would be an impact on the historical district or and on his property in particular, because he's the next door neighbor to Mr. and Mrs. Turner. The same with Ms. Grumman's comments. She questioned, for example, or made a statement that she thought that there was not sufficient rear yardage. And again, we counted that there is more than enough. Again, the code provides for 16 feet, and there's 27 point something feet for rear yardage in this case. So we would ask that this body consider our appeal and grant our appeal based on the 4 items I've indicated. And based on the procedural deficiencies, including the conflict between the technically complete minor subdivision application, which did not require inclusion of certain information such as the architectural plans and site plans, yet which lack thereof was the basis for the Historic Preservation Commission's decision, and the recently Historic Preservation Commission's limited knowledge and experience with its role and statutory responsibilities under Ordinance 2012-09. Despite the time and expense the applicant to obtain the chain of title for the subject property as requested, the commissioners gave it no weight in making their determination. It appears that greater weight was given to the objectors who provided no supporting evidence to their representations as to oversized lots, yard setbacks, and purported negative impact. And finally, there's an apparent conflict, as I mentioned earlier, between 2 of the ordinances, Section 6 of Ordinance 2012-09, which appears to require the certificate of appropriateness with regard to a subdivision, minor subdivision, and Section 3 of Ordinance 2012-16, which states only the key contributing properties would be subject to the certificate of appropriateness provisions. So thus, in closing, the issuance of the certificate of appropriateness or its resolution, which was conditioned on the applicant conforming to the township's stated design elements and/or addressed the Historic Preservation Commission's concerns, would have been an appropriate outcome in this case. We're asking the Board of Adjustment and its deliberations to consider this as a viable solution and that it would satisfy both the Historic Preservation Commission's mandated concerns and the applicant's desire to remain in South Orange in a smaller and more efficient dwelling. Anyone have any questions, comments, concerns?
Question, counsel. What's our charge here?
I believe the charge now is an appellate review of sorts, so that there's not a rehearing of the hearing before the HPC, but instead a determination whether or not the HPC's decision was arbitrary or capricious, unreasonable. The standard of proof for that would be substantial evidence.
What are the potential outcomes?
There are a variety of outcomes here. There are 2 arguments being made by the Turners, and one is it's procedural, that the way the ordinances are written, or perhaps because of the way they're written, they're not required in the first instance to get a certificate of appropriateness for this subdivision. And if the board were to agree with that argument, then it would grant the appeal to that extent and free the applicant of having to obtain that HPC approval in order to go to the planning board. The board could find that, for example, there was insufficient evidence produced below to allow the board to make an informed decision, that perhaps there were questions unanswered that needed to be answered and more evidence needed to be provided, in which case they might remand it to the HPC and ask them to make that inquiry. The board could also deny the application on either the substantive or the procedural grounds and say that the HPC was correct in making its decision. There was substantial evidence. It wasn't unreasonable for them to conclude that under this ordinance they were required to obtain the certificate, and having that requirement, they were unable to overcome it for any reason.
Let me ask you a more nuanced question. If we accept the applicant's argument that it should have never gone for a certificate of appropriateness, do we even need to comment on the second complaints about whether substantively?
I think not, Mr. Chairman. I think that would be a rather narrow and, in this case, proper approach, if that were the approach the board were to take. there is an element here of interpretation of this ordinance that I believe the board has the authority, given the fact that this is an appeal from this decision of the HPC. There's an element of what does that ordinance say, and did the HPC properly interpret it in making its decision? And in our appellate review, this board has the authority, the zoning board always has the authority to interpret ordinances of town. So to that extent, they have, in my view, the authority to say what these ordinances amount to, whether or not there was a necessary for this applicant to obtain that certificate.
Yeah, I have my thoughts on this because I think it's an interesting appeal. Let me just go ahead. I think this is rather easy decision here. If you look here at the first ordinance, with both of these ordinances, first of all, were passed before the applicant came before the HPC. That's the first thing we have to know. So they were both in effect. The one came before the other. So 09 came before 016. In 09, just like the attorney said, it talked about properties that should go for certificate of appropriateness. Interestingly, if you look at section 7, there's a separate section that any application to the planning board or zoning board shall be referred to the commission for non-binding comment. So they all have to go to the HPC, but only certain ones have to have a certificate of appropriateness, which is a higher standard.
Right, so anything in the zone. Right.
Doesn't even say in the zone. Shall refer to the commission every application for development submitted to either board for development. And the commission may provide its non-binding advice, which can be an oral testimony or report, but that's not a certificate of appropriateness. When you then go to the next ordinance, it says section 3, it's clearly to me a clarification. Section 3, where I'm just repeating what the attorney said. Where an historic district is designated as historic or declared a local landmark, only the key contributing properties within the historic district identified as such, including properties, buildings, sites, structures, and objects, shall be considered designated historic local landmarks, subject to the certificate of appropriateness provisions of the previous ordinance.
You said section 3 of 9?
2012.
This is in 212-16.
Oh, okay, 16, okay.
So that to me, and then it lists in the Schedule A what the key contributing properties are. So I think that says it right there.
Well,
And just for the record, this was brought up in the first meeting when Commissioner Don was suggesting that I had not completed the application for the certificate of appropriateness by not checking off the property as an historic site. And again, it was because of this contradictory, and I said it was not key. She kept on saying, but it's contributing. And if you read these transcripts, you'll see that exchange. So I didn't win that night, obviously, but
I read the entire transcript and your appeal, and you did, I guess, everything you could do working in a very fluid environment, I'll put it that way. And the ordinances, to me, are somewhat inconsistent, but Section 9 of the earlier ordinance says that no subdivision for a lot in a historic district and on which new construction is proposed shall be approved without a certificate of appropriateness. I mean, I understand what you said and what Chairman...
Where does it?
Section 9 of the... Section 9 of...
9A1B?
09. Yes.
Bouncing back and forth here.
9A1B. Susan, is this,
that's, now I got it.
I have a question for our planner. Is Montrose Park designated in the historic preservation plan element of the master plan?
The historic preservation element of the master plan is currently in draft form. There is no, the HPC is working on that. There is another provision in the municipal land use law that permits the governing body or the Board of Trustees to determine certain sites and districts. The Montrose Historic District is on the National and State Register, and there is an inventory that was done in 1997 when the Montrose District was nominated and accepted as a National and State Historic Site. This site was deemed to be contributing in those documents. It's interesting, the mix of key contributing together. They have very distinct definitions, contributing and key. I would note that.
I don't see the definition of key in what is it, 16 here, just a list.
There is, when you go back to the original inventory, and you go back to the original information that was submitted with the application, and discussion of the Montrose District, there are definitions in a number of places regarding those. There is contributing, there is non-contributing, and there is key as a distinction.
Those are the Montrose documents.
Those are the Montrose 1997 documents that were the formal documents that were submitted for national and state registered designation.
So how does an applicant know to look at those original documents that were submitted for the HPD?
They are documents that are on the website, the village's website under the Montrose District.
Okay.
And there is information that's on that, as well as it is a checklist item. And the original checklist that was submitted to the our checklist review that was done in August of 2013 did note, based upon the checklist, that this was a contributing site within the Montrose Historic District.
Contributing.
Contributing.
But not, it wasn't listed as key.
It was not listed as key. It's a contributing site.
Right. And does it fall under the definition of key? Because I didn't find that definition myself, so.
No, it does not.
Okay.
The distinction, but there is no definition of key contributing.
They
Okay.
simply designate them.
There
Correct.
was again, there are three categories under historic preservation. They're based upon the definitions. It's non-contributing, contributing, and key.
What was the third one?
And key. Those are three distinct categories.
The resolution that went along with ordinance 2012-16 refers to, it says, whereas the Board of Trustees also recognizes the survey that was prepared by Zakalak Associates for the County of Essex, Department of Planning and Economic Development, in July 1986, which surveyed and listed, register-eligible, and potentially register-eligible properties, districts, structures, sites, and buildings in the village. And there's at least on Montrose Park's website, it has the Historic Preservation Consultant Report from Yolanda Zakalak, which I guess is what this is referring to, that talks about the significance of Montrose Park and the size of the properties, and that there were restrictions, apparently not in all of the deeds, but there were restrictions that they wanted to keep the lots large and for residential use. I have the language here, but I don't want to read it all. I guess one of the things that could be with the deed is that the deed may have been very important if there were a restriction in the deed to the Turner's property. That may be not dispositive, but very important to the commission's determination. But the fact that there was no restriction on lot size in that deed is not determinative that it's not important, because there obviously were in other deeds. And the Zakalak report talks specifically about Thomas Kingman, who it says, who insisted that lots measure no less than 100 by 200. This and other restrictions resulted in the formation of an enclave of wealthy residents and the concentration of large historical revival houses. I don't know, I mean, that stuff is out there. I don't know to what extent an applicant is required to ferret it out.
Well, I contacted the planner's office for input after I received her letter of incompleteness and designating and indicating this was a contributing property. Otherwise, we had no idea. And we should not be in a position to assume, particularly when I had the ordinance that showed that it wasn't a key property when we went to the office to submit, to get the application, or to resolve some issues we had with the application. And I said, it's not included. And my initial application indicated, I didn't check it off.
I understand what you say, and that Section 3 is conflicting with another section. It seems to.
And again, I believe that the application for the subdivision, the minor subdivision, should have been approved, in our opinion, and again, with any necessary conditions, either by the Central Planning Board, if necessary, or the Historic Preservation Commission, as to design elements. And I think that's really their primary concern, in addition to, I guess, the lot size. But again, the lot sizes are such that they're more than was required under the zoning ordinance. The lots contiguous to this property, not necessarily contiguous, but in the surrounding area, have various lot sizes, various dwelling sizes, various design elements. So for the resolution to indicate that this would have some negative impact on the design of the community is not logical.
Well, it is.
If you drive through that immediate area, there are different styles of housing, different lot sizes.
Right. Some of what you see that you reference is part of the reason for the historic district to have been created in the first place.
Exactly.
But these are the so-called historic properties. I'm not talking about the non-conforming. I'm talking about the contributing and/or key properties in the Montrose Park Historic District.
Well, Mr. Dwyer, can we have dicta in our conversation here that doesn't necessarily get put into the resolution, where we give our thoughts about some of the stuff that the attorney has suggested, or should we just not say anything?
You're free to say whatever you think is relevant, Mr. Chairman.
But it wouldn't necessarily go into the resolution if we back off on that?
That'll go in a minute.
The resolution will reflect what the majority of the board votes.
I mean, I guess we could do that if somebody wanted to in a letter.
You mean, yes, you could.
In a letter to whoever you wanted to send a letter to.
Yes. Generally, we don't add dissenting opinions in the resolution.
No,
And I just, again, for the record, I'm not presenting any new information, de novo information. This is information that was presented on the record at 3 hearings, along with exhibits and documentation.
We understand that.
No, I'm just putting it on the record.
Everything's on the record.
I had forgotten what Ms. Gruhl talked, that particular paragraph that talked about there would be no subdivision, and I'm glad she brought that up, because I'd forgotten that one. I was looking at an earlier part of that ordinance of 09.
You mean Mr. Adler?
Ms. Gruhl brought up the
It's section 9.
Section 9. There would be no-
A1B.
There would be no subdivision.
Right.
I was looking at the earlier part under section 2 about certificate of appropriateness. Anyways, I still think that section 3 is a clarification of the previous ordinance, and I know not everybody may agree with me. And as such, to me, the issue, I would propose that we draw it very narrowly and not even comment upon the attorney's comments about the rationality and how this has to be approved. We don't even comment upon those particular arguments. And we leave that for the planning board to do. I think this could be determined very narrowly, that if the planning board wishes to have the Historic Preservation Commission give non-binding advice, it's free to do so. But that it was inappropriate, given the ordinance of Section 3, for it to have held the applicant to the higher standard of a certificate of appropriateness.
Unless section of 2012-09 9A1D applies.
Well,
It does apply.
it's whether you consider it just simply contradictory to me, whether it's just contradictory, or whether you consider this a clarification, or a limiting of the previous one. And that's, I guess, where we use our judgment. I think it applies. I think it would apply, except that...
Well, it expressly applies.
Yeah, but Section 3 seems to say, well, wait a minute, it narrows it to the key contributing properties. That's at least my interpretation. Correct, convince me otherwise.
I don't think the intent was to do away with all of Section 9. Section 3 to do away with it, I don't think so.
So then, why would they even put in Section 3?
Beats me.
Well, it's, as a matter of law, you've got a document that doesn't quite supersede, but it postdates the other one, and it refers to the other one, and it looks like it intends to strengthen it. Wouldn't you want to, I don't know, other case history? Wouldn't you want to follow what the current code says?
I don't think there's any specific rule of construction that says a subsequent ordinance on the same subject that does not specifically withdraw the earlier.
Certainly not the whole thing.
Would necessarily supersede it. It may simply be a supplemental.
Right. This looks like, as Dr. Reeves suggests, a clarification. And so it's in many ways shorter and more direct, and maybe it's because people complained that the other was too hard to read. I don't really know. But it doesn't take away the descriptive elements of what you need to do. There are very specific things that the HPC board the commission has to consider when reviewing a property. Those things are all listed in the older document, and not quite so much here. And I don't know, it's interesting that it says subject to right in the beginning of the ordinance, right at the last part of the ordinance paragraph, the abstract, if you will, subject to the certificate of appropriateness provisions. But interestingly, actually I just realized that it only talks about the certificate of appropriateness provisions. So once you define that one is required, then you apply those provisions in 09. I could read it that way.
I didn't
And-
understand what you just said.
Well, here, let me just read. An ordinance amending Section 92-3 of the Code of Township, South Orange Village, to add a definition of local landmark and supplement the land development ordinances by providing criteria for the evaluation and designation of local landmarks and by establishing an initial schedule of local landmarks designated as historic property sites, structures, objects, or districts, subject to the certificate of appropriateness provisions of Ordinance 2012-09. So in this document, they define what requires a certificate of appropriateness by being a property that's a key property. This property is not a key property. I think I think it would be reasonable for us to say that that this supersedes that element in Section 9 of the 09 provision with regard to whether or not this property needs to have a certificate of appropriateness.
So you're agreeing with me?
If that's what you say. Well, we're having conversation about it, so the more we talk about it,
Yeah, well, I just want to
the
make
clearer
sure.
vision.
Sometimes I
know.
get things wrong, but...
Right. No, I am agreeing with you. It's just, I definitely think that it's something that could be fixed in a future document, but at the moment, if that's not the intention, it needs to be fixed, and there's no way an applicant would know otherwise.
I'm interested to hear the counter argument of why this Section 3, since it was written later and refers to the earlier ordinance, why it wouldn't limit the 09 ordinance of, the broader requirement of no subdivision without a certificate of appropriateness for any property, why it wouldn't limit it. How do we construct it otherwise?
I suppose you could say it doesn't
I am keeping the
expressly-
blinders on, not saying what I think about the applicant's other arguments about the merits of the substance of their variance application that will go before the
Right.
planning board. I'm just,
Right. You could argue that it doesn't specifically say that this supersedes, the language in 09.
I'm not as technically oriented on the fine points, but it just seems to me that this is a conflict that we're not going to be able to resolve here.
The microphone.
Oh, I say, it just seems to me that despite the technical issues back and forth, it seems to me that there's a conflict between the ordinances, which we're not going to be able to resolve here tonight.
we have to.
Yeah, we're
We can
like
make
a
decision,
judicial
but
body.
I don't know that we can resolve the
so-
conflict.
Well, right. We
But
make a decision,
We'll make a
and the
decision.
Board of Trustees may think we're wrong, and they may want to clarify things later, and that's the way
That-
law works.
That's fine, but I think for us to do our job, I think we do have to take into account and go beyond this unsolvable dilemma and go to the issues of substance and where is the harm and the precedent, and then reach a decision based upon
Okay, so,
other factors than whether or not these two ordinances give us a clear answer.
so you're not willing to take the narrow approach?
Exactly.
Mr. Adler?
Sir.
Do you agree with Mr. Shapiro that we should open this up for further discussion? So there was essentially two levels. The attorney says, the HPC shouldn't have heard it. That's one argument. And then if we say, well, we're not going to rule based only upon that, we're going to get into the substance. Where are you on this? Mr. Shapiro thinks we should get into the substance of whether the HPC, on the merits of the case, acted appropriately.
Well, I'd like to, only because I don't agree that A9 is superseded by Section 3.
Okay?
So if I'm right, then we have to get into that. If I'm wrong,
I
We
don't
don't.
think it's right and wrong.
I don't think it's a matter whether it was superseded so much as whether it's reasonable for an applicant to think that it was.
No, I don't agree it's what the applicant thinks. I think it's, our role here is to determine in a quasi-judicial function is what the law, interpret the law. I don't care what the applicant thinks.
No
I don't
offense.
mean that dismissive. I don't care in the technical sense. We're here to make this difficult decision. We can open it up. Two is not a majority, is it?
Correct.
All right, so then, you want to talk about the substance. Let's open it up, so we don't have a majority here to
Right.
To grant the procedural
to grant the
appeal.
procedural appeal. So we open it up into the substantive questions. Let's go.
Do we bother to vote on the procedural appeal part, just to
Well,
put it in the record, or?
Well, it's clear we have two of the,
I think we're going, I don't think that we should,
Okay,
but we'll operate under the assumption that
right.
that's the way the board is headed.
It leaves it open for us voting on it later after discussion, right?
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so Mr. Shapiro.
Right, on a substance basis, I'm persuaded that the testimony being that the proposed lots and the subdivision can still be considered generous and that there are lots smaller within the district. The review of the location map bears that out. There are other lots and in proximity to the property which are comparable or in fact smaller than the proposed new lots. And there are smaller dwellings within the Montrose Park Historic District in proximity to the property. So that speaks to me that the proposed subdivision and the proposed dwelling would not be doing damage to the Montrose Park Historic District, since there are other properties which are precedential, and that this would not be in any way detrimental
So
to
if
the...
there's one smaller lot throughout the whole district, then everything goes down to that lowest common denominator.
I didn't say that. You said that.
Okay, so explain
I said
to me.
that there are other lots, not a single lot. There are other lots, 12, 13, 14, and 15, 4 lots within the district, and there are smaller dwellings, plural. So, therefore, I don't feel that the applicant should be held to an arbitrary standard when there are precedents that would, I think, supersede that.
Oh.
That's my feeling.
Well, I think, as Mr. DeScala said, that's probably, these smaller houses or small lots is probably why the trustees passed the ordinance for preservation. I mean, you're trying to preserve it. And even counsel at the hearing acknowledged that the HPC should not exacerbate the nonconforming improvements. That's at page 20, line 19 to 23. So, I mean, it's important that there is a commission, the trustees felt there was, and that they preserve what there is to be preserved. Also, I think that as Mr. Dwyer said, it's not our job to decide if this is good or bad at first blush, but only whether the commission was arbitrary and capricious in making its decision. And we're not going to substitute our opinion for theirs, as I understand it. Mr. Dwyer, to what extent, I mean, there's material in the testimony before the commission that I think is important that is not in the resolution. In other words, they didn't say we're relying on this in the resolution, but nevertheless it's there. And I think it probably colored what they were thinking when they talked about the lot size. So to what extent can we look at that?
Definitely can look at that.
Well, in that respect, then, there are some things that that they did talk about. Commissioner Barnett said he's struggling with both an individual driveway on South Orange Avenue, and at that point, the street, Kingman is blocked off, it's gated off, so there is no entrance to or from South Orange Avenue. And at that point on South Orange Avenue, I don't think there are any individual curb cuts out to South Orange Avenue. And he said he's struggling with that, both an individual driveway on South Orange Avenue and with the visual and aesthetic aspect of what the applicant is proposing on South Orange Avenue. And visual and aesthetic is one of the things that they're charged, I understand, with reviewing. Commissioner Don said that part of what makes the historic district are the current size lots and the intent of the original developers, which is reflected on the website and in that report that the resolution passed with 2012-16 referred to. And I think, I guess the commission's knowledge of the area is something maybe they should have put on the record, but I think the fact that they said that one of the things they're relying on, and maybe the prime thing, is the size of the lots in Montrose Park Historic District. You know, to some extent, we have to defer to their knowledge of the area. That's one of the things that the trustees, by the ordinance, look at when they are appointing the commissioners. At least one class has to be. I forget the language, but it deals with them being, if not explicitly, implicitly familiar with the area. So, you know, I don't know. I don't know if I would have come out the same way. I'm not sure that I want to say that they were arbitrary and capricious.
Well, there's a couple other complaints, one being related to the requirement of the HPC for architectural drawings, where they're not required in the site plan application. That's one of those things that seems arbitrary, I believe, to the applicant, right? And there's also there's a claim that there's a lack of guidelines of things to consider and to look out for, so that there's the appearance that lot size was never raised except for at the meeting, and so it was unclear to the applicant that lot size was an issue.
Well, two things. First, as to the design and style, I think you're right. I think the applicant is right. There's no guidance other than that it has to conform to certain standards.
Right.
But there's no, and the commission's attorney, Mr. Sullivan, said you're not required to provide that, to provide architectural drawings. So, I mean, it's difficult for the applicant to figure out what to do there.
Right, yet the board expressed a lot of concern about the lack of knowledge about the design of the architecture of the building.
Yeah, I agree. That's makes it virtually impossible for an applicant to proceed in a rational manner. Section 10A of 2012-09 says that the commission's determination on an application shall be in accordance with existing building and zoning codes of the township. Now, I don't, so if that is meaningful,
I'm sorry, what section was that?
I'm sorry, it's the
10, you said?
10, Section 10A, third full paragraph.
Thank you.
Next to last sentence.
My electronic version is battery died, so if you don't mind reading that aloud.
Yeah. The application will be reviewed at the commission's next regularly scheduled meeting, and then I'm going to skip down. The next to last sentence, the commission's determination shall focus on how the proposed undertaking would affect the historic properties, structures, sites, or districts' historical significance and integrity, as outlined in sections 9 and 10 of this chapter, and shall be in accordance with existing building and zoning codes of the township.
Right.
So, I mean, if that means what it says, then the applicant, knew, at least to that extent, that,
Well, they knew they needed a variance for lot requirements, right?
yeah. But I don't know how that works, Mr. Dwyer. Does that take jurisdiction away from the planning board, or how would that work?
No, the planning board would still have jurisdiction over granting a variance or not.
Okay, so does this application meet that requirement? In other words, could the commission have approved this existing application? In other words, or not?
Was it unreasonable for them to have, would it have been unreasonable for them to approve it, given the fact that the resulting subdivision would be less than what the town ordinance requires?
Yeah.
I think that's the question.
Would we have approved it? I don't know. That's another question entirely.
May I comment on this?
Sure.
Section 10A seems to imply that this is, applicable when a construction permit is being sought. And it seems that this is the cart before the horse. The planning board is to decide on the subdivision. The Historic Preservation Commission, pursuant to this ordinance 2012-9, based on the way it's written, requires a certificate of appropriateness for subdivision, point blank. Section 3 of ordinance 2012-16 only applies to key contributing properties. It seems to me, and I mentioned this also at the hearings, that it was most likely that my client would be before or not necessarily before them, but they would be considering her design of the house as part of this construction permit requirement.
That they would be considering the design of the house when they got before the planning board.
Right,
The homeowners know that, right?
not for the subdivision.
For the subdivision?
For the subdivision, again, no architectural drawings are required. We were here for a minor subdivision, period.
I think,
Well, and once that
would it
was-
be fair to say that the planning board would be authorized to know that if it granted a subdivision, what the negative, whether or not the negative criteria could be met would depend at least in part upon what was planning to be built on a lot that was smaller than what the ordinance requires?
But again, your guidance and instructions don't require it. That's a costly venture for an applicant. My client chose to go for the minor subdivision, which was her right to do.
But that would require a variance, which would require that meeting the negative criteria, which would require having to judge what the impact would be, which would require having to know what was going to be put there, right?
Right, that's
That's what we tend to do.
That's,
But we're not coming before the Board
I
of
know.
Adjustment. We're going before the Central Planning Board.
But isn't it true that applicants seeking subdivision approval routinely before land use boards show them what would be built in order to allow them to determine the negative criteria?
Not all the time. I've had applicants just seek subdivisions, and basically indicating what they propose to do on the site, which my client did. We provided a possible footprint to allow for the setbacks so that only the 2 variances were sought. I think there's an opportunity for either the Historic Preservation Commission and/or the Planning Board to look at the design before it's even built. I would think it would be the Historic Preservation Commission would have that purview. But again, that's not even in your ordinance. I brought that up at one of the hearings. It seemed logical to me that because they're concerned with the aesthetics, at some point they would see it. And it would be at this point, I would think, when construction permits were required to be submitted to the city, to the village.
So you're saying at that point in time, then that would go to the HPC? At that
Well,
point in
first of all,
time?
there's a couple of issues. One is the Historic Preservation Commission, again, it's on the record, advisory body for this particular application, or it's, you don't get the certificate, you're dead in the waters. And at this point, based on the resolution, we're dead in the waters. My client cannot get the subdivision. That, I don't, and that's the conflict. Okay, if it's advisory, and I had that discussion with counsel on the record, is it advisory? He thought no, I thought yes. So we were back and forth with that for a minute or two. So procedurally, today we're here.
Can I interrupt you? I'm sorry, because you said something which I'm not clear about, which was, are you saying that the HPC would have been involved once again later on down the road when the applicant sought a building permit?
That's what this ordinance implies. It's in section 10A, 2012-09, if the proposed undertaking requires a review regardless of whether a construction permit is required by the village, the administrative officer shall notify the applicant that he or she must submit a request for a certificate of appropriateness prior to obtaining a construction permit. So, how many times does an applicant have to go before the Historic Preservation Commission?
Right, so wouldn't it make sense for the HPC to ask for that information when you were there?
No. Why do we have to do your job? I'm getting, this is a little frustrating. Your ordinances say require, according to 2012-09, that a minor subdivision requires a certificate of appropriateness, which can only be granted by the Historic Preservation Commission. A subdivision application to the Central Planning Board does not require an architectural drawing or site plan.
They would ask for it anyway, though.
They could ask for it, but it's not in the instructions. We're guided by what your ordinance
because
states.
when they would ask for it, because they wouldn't be able to judge the negative criteria.
Well, they deemed the application complete.
But that doesn't mean they granted the variance.
Preservation Commission.
If I may jump in, because I agree with Mr. Dwyer, and we represent a number of municipal boards. And when there are variances, even for minor subdivisions, it would not be a checklist item. But of course, any completeness says anything can be asked by the board as you continue. It's not unusual, we've seen it oftentimes, that just like what Mr. Dwyer said, in the evaluation of the negative criteria, oftentimes it's necessary to see and for the board to have detailed elevations and conceptual drawings in order to evaluate the negative criteria. And that can be, I've seen it be a condition of approval.
And I happen to know that because I represent the South Orange Planning Board. And they've done that.
But again, a condition of approval. We would be before the Central Planning Board, and we can't get to the Central Planning Board because we don't have a certificate of appropriateness.
But the point being, but I think that there's a point here that it would not be unusual for a planning board or an HPC in light of evaluating the negative aspect and its impact. And there are very specific standards in the '09 ordinance. Of course, they're always qualitative and subjective, but what the procedure for review is, and that would be one of, in what I would suggest could be a consideration by that board in evaluating its impact on these criteria that are to be used in reviewing a certificate of appropriateness.
Thank you. I agree. So I'm essentially, this is where now I'm turning the tables here. Now that we've opened the issue of the arbitrariness and capriciousness, I don't think it was arbitrary and capricious, what they decided. For example, look here at Section 9, A1C3. The impact of the proposed change on the historic and architectural significance of the historic Cider District. And then the next one, the extent to which the proposed action would adversely affect the public's view of a historic property's structure Cider District from a public street or other public property. So given that this is a historic preservation commission, it's a conservative body, they want things, essentially, they're interested in maintaining some antiquity here, sameness, homogeneity of what exists. They would be concerned that an applicant, any applicant would subdivide and put a tiny little home that was inconsistent with most of the other homes in the district, not all of them. The fact that there's one or two are around, it does not disqualify these conditions. So I think that was appropriate for them to consider what the house would look like. And yes, the planning board would do the same thing. Furthermore, in their actual resolution, they talk about an integral part of the character of the district is the large lot sizes. Subdividing the existing lot into smaller lots would be inconsistent with the intent and purpose of the district. And I know you all have said, well, where is this the intent and purpose of the district? I think what they were getting at was district melds with the zoning. I don't know if you're aware, and if your clients are aware, that around 2005 or thereabouts, the Board of Trustees changed the lot width ordinances in the residential districts, increased the lot width sizes precisely to prevent what your clients are trying to do, precisely to do this, because they were worried about subdivisions. I was there for that. I was on this zoning board, so I had to know what this is about. So that's where I see what they're getting into, where they talk about subdivisions into smaller lots. They're talking about lot widths, which is what one of your variances would be. So yes, I think that gets right to the heart of their objection, is this lot width variance would be contrary to historic preservation, as well as a relatively recent ordinance created by the Board of Trustees.
That recent resolution, again, that resulted in A75 requiring 7,500 square feet. And these two lots exceed that, almost double, if not more than double.
I think it was lot width. I don't think it was,
It's
I could be
the
wrong.
area.
And multiple components.
And
I think you're right, actually. The only thing that particular ordinance change was for, the historic-related one, was just the lot width. They didn't change the minimum lot size requirement.
It was
I don't
width,
think.
correct, Susan?
Excuse me?
Wasn't it width in the two, RA 100 and
It was in all
RA?
of the, yes, it was in the residential, single-family residential zones. It was lot width
Right.
that was
Just width.
considered.
But they didn't change the lot size requirements at all.
No, it was the lot width.
Right. So the lot size has nothing to do with that particular effort.
And along with that, in part, Commissioner Dunn said that what the applicant is proposing would change the streetscape because the front would be on South Orange Avenue, whereas now it's on Kingman Road, and so it would change, you'd see the side of the house on Kingman Road, if I understand
Right.
the applicant. the application. So,
The house was, the proposed dwelling would front South Orange Avenue.
exactly.
There are other dwellings, again, within proximity that front and egress and ingress off of South Orange Avenue. That was also in the record. So, and then also in the, at the hearings, again, the commissioners didn't evidence real knowledge of the area. There were several questions concerning the specific area, if you look through the transcript. So,
That doesn't mean
to
they didn't
rely-
know the answers.
huh?
Sometimes commissioners ask questions, and they know fully what the answers are.
I don't know about that. I can't assume that. So again, is this to be an advisory? I don't know how you're going to interpret the ordinances. I believe, again, that Section 3, this probably should have been advisory. There were opportunities for the Historic Preservation Commission at some point through this process to review my applicant's intentions, either as an advisory body under under ordinance 2012-16, if it's under 2012-09, under section 10A with regard to looking at the design, if that was so important to them. Again, if they had a checklist at the time the application was provided or presented, that would have significantly helped my client's decision-making as to go forward or not. And I would assume that at some point, I know the checklist is being prepared. I don't think it's been completed as yet. I'm sure they're going to revisit this issue. Again, I think in my closings in my letter, I had indicated that, that they could have issued a certificate of appropriateness, and one of the commissioners did ask, would it have been appropriate for them to issue a certificate of appropriateness with certain conditions, and that's what we were, expecting would occur, but not a flat-out no. Again, my client cannot move forward without if you interpret ordinance 2012-09, section 9, an applicant for a minor subdivision who does not receive a certificate of appropriateness cannot move forward. And in my opinion, that takes the jurisdiction out of the hands of the Central Planning Board.
Is there anything that keeps you from reapplying?
Excuse me?
Is there anything that keeps you from reapplying for that certificate of appropriateness, perhaps submitting the requested materials?
We don't know what the requested materials are.
Oh, they wanted to see architectural drawings.
I would think at some point you could reapply. But again, that's a costly venture. This is a individual family. This is not a corporation. This is not Seton Hall University. So we don't have deep pockets. And that's one of the other concerns, the monies that have expended. I mean, literally thousands of dollars for literally a minor subdivision for a family who has been in this community for over 27 years.
Right.
So I don't know how the decision-making, I don't know what else I could add this evening, or, I don't know how you make a decision or how we hear of that decision.
Well, I think you've made your case clearly and cogently. Obviously, we don't agree with you, but we don't all agree with each other either, too. I think you've made your points clear. And I think we, as a board, now have to decide on this. I think Ms. Gruhl offered useful information. Mr. Dwyer offered useful legal information. I agree with both of them as to the substance of matters, and I would request that you speak to your clients about the hurdles that they would have to overcome before the planning board, because I don't think this is arbitrary and capricious, and I think this is the same stuff that the planning board will also consider. It doesn't look like my proposal would gain a majority vote that the HPC just should not have issued a certificate of appropriateness. It doesn't look like we're there.
We should not have required. Should have required one.
Should not have required a certificate of appropriateness. That, the board doesn't have a majority for that.
Do you want to ask again and see, just pull the board?
let's pull
That's
the
why,
board.
that's why we didn't vote
Right.
before, right?
Look, yeah, so you see where I've gone. I think it shouldn't, this, to me, was clear that it was not appropriate for the Historic Preservation Commission to have required a certificate of appropriateness for a non-key property. However, if we think that, if that is not something that the majority, meaning 3 out of 4 of us, agree, then we get into this messier substantive issues of whether the HPC acted arbitrarily and capriciously. I don't think they did at all. I think they did exactly what was their charge. So, you know, it's an interesting situation to be in where
Not precisely on your point, but one of the things that I'm a little hung up on is the opinion that council gave us that we're here as a appellate body, and as an appellate body, I don't think we are bound in any way to defer to the decisions made by the Historic Preservation Committee. Otherwise, we would be simply rubber stamping what they did. I think we have to reach our own independent determination as to whether or not, A, they acted appropriately, B, whether or not a certificate of appropriateness should have been issued at all, and C, whether or not they may have put the applicants in an impossible position as far as blocking them from moving forward and going to the planning board for a determination and a variance. So,
Mr. Shapiro, I'm not sure
I'm
that...
conflicted.
Right, I think that the first and last points that you just made were, I think, relevant to what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But the whole rubber stamp thing, I don't think really applies.
No, but
because
I'm just saying, I
we
don't
are
think
not
our
hearing an
position is to
application.
defer
Right.
to their judgment.
Right.
I think
but
we
we're
have to
not
use
hearing
our
it.
own judgment.
We're just not hearing an application, so we can only, it's very limited to what we can do here. So the last point you made is whether or not, you know, the applicant, you know, had the ability to understand what the laws were
Right.
and were able to follow them. That goes to what I was saying before, and it's not the individual applicant, it would be any applicant that were to look at our regulations and submit an application for an approval. And I think that that's relevant and important thing to consider. And one of the problems that frequently occurs with the application process, with the development process in general, whenever anybody wants to do anything, it's communicating what the rules are to that person or that applicant before they embark on a big mission to get everything done. They hire contractors and, you know, architects and all that other stuff. And this is an area where it's a very easy mistake for an applicant to make, where it says it's got to be a key thing. They see a list of key properties and it isn't there. So that's why I was in agreement before that we should, you know, keep it simple and go down that route. I definitely don't want to go through the process of deciding whether this particular property deserves historic, you know, recognition or approvals, or whether or not it deserves a variance, because that's just not what we're charged with. But I definitely would stick with what Mr. Reeves originally proposed.
it's a lot neater, and they still have to, you know, even if we say we agree that they don't need a certificate of appropriateness, the planning board still, by ordinance, is required to throw it in the lap of the HPC, which may advise, if the HPC so considers it worthy of advisement, and they could give essentially the same advice. It would be advice. It wouldn't stop the application. And the planning board still has to make the decision as to whether this subdivision, given the lot width considerations, and the planning board is certainly aware of the relatively recent change in the ordinance, they would weigh all that. You know, that's for let them
Right.
decide.
Right.
I think it's cleaner that way. And we can just focus very narrowly on that.
And so what you're proposing then would not block the applicant from going forward.
No.
No, in fact, it would allow them to go forward.
So I can support that.
It would, it perhaps would frustrate the HPC, though, just so the politics you're aware, you know, but it's something that it's a flaw in the way, as I see it, it's a flaw in the way that the code is written, and it just needs to be addressed, and until it is, then.
I don't even see it as a flaw in the way the code is written. I see it as it was a change that was meant to limit the properties that were to be considered, and the HPC missed it. It was a new board. They missed it, you know. They missed it.
You're possibly right. It's an interpretation, and we could put that in the resolution. That's fine with me.
You know, and if the Board of Trustees, hearing this, thinks we missed it, they can quickly create an ordinance. I don't think we missed it.
Right. Well, we have to make a determination one way or the other.
So, Bob, what do you think?
Which Bob?
Bob Adler. Bob's?
Got to put them on different ends of the circle.
Well, I stated what I thought, but I understand your argument, and, you know, it's a way to go. That is to rule on the procedural
Right.
in favor of the applicant.
Good. I think that's a wiser, they still have their obligations to meet before the planning board. They can still go before the HPC for advice, but I think this is the proper decision based upon the law. Okay, so may we have...
Well, I'm looking for the language that's specifically that we could address in our resolution in terms of the question to us.
Can I start to mutter out some language here?
Sure.
That might be helpful? That the board, in its role as an appellate body, has determined that the HPC improperly required a certificate of appropriateness from the applicant in contradiction of Ordinance 201216, Section 3. Specifically, the applicant's property is not a key contributing property in this historic district, and thus was not subject to a certificate of appropriateness.
If that's a motion, I'll second it.
Does that make sense? Do we need to add stuff to that?
I think that captures it, Mr. Chair.
Is it the HBC that requires a certificate of appropriateness, or the Planning Commission that required it?
It's the ordinance, the way the ordinance is written, the
requires
HPC
it. Right.
issues it.
Right.
I guess they require it if they issue it, I don't know. I'll write issue.
All right. We'll vote again on the resolution.
Is there, do you want to call a vote, Mr. Chairman?
Okay, so somebody seconded?
I second it.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so may we have a vote? And this is to accept...
Grant the appeal on procedural grounds.
Grant the appeal on procedural grounds.
Thank you very much.
Well, wait, we got to hear the vote.
Oh, I'm sorry, sorry.
Wait.
I thought you voted. Sorry.
Give it a minute.
Mr. DeScala,
Yes.
Mr. Adler,
I'm still thinking.
Mr. Shapiro,
Yes.
Mr. Reeves.
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So
All right.
you know you're still going to have to put together some architectural drawings. You have to go through all that for the
I'll
plan.
advise my client.
Right.
Was.
So we'll get there'll be a resolution issued from this body.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
A resolution will be issued from this body.
That's right.
Correct? And then we proceed to the central, procedurally, how do
As
you
I
get
see it
that?
procedurally, I see that resolution would
to
allow you
central-
then to go forward before the planning board.
Okay, it goes to the central planning board, and then we have to set up a date with the central planning,
Well, you
hearing
have
date.
to, I think your application was already filed, if I'm not
Yes, it
mistaken.
was.
So
Okay.
it will be placed on the agenda once that resolution is adopted by this
Okay.
board.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so next month, September, we have Seton Hall on board.
Should we bring sleeping bag?
A large bottle of Diet Coke is what I'll have. And that's all we have right now. That's probably all we'll be able to do in that month is Seton Hall. So,
Is there anything else, Jetta, coming in?
Not at this moment.
you're welcome.
Good luck.
So, Jetta, can you speak? I assume that the Singular is going to call you and give you dates that they could do it, and we'll see if it coincides when we could do a special meeting.
Right.
Just so you know, the planning board was looking at special meeting dates last night. The facility has very limited access in August,
Yeah.
so maybe September.
Yeah, it would, oh, yeah, well, I wouldn't even look in August. People are on vacation, I'm on vacation, and other people are on vacation. Let's not even look at August, let's look
Okay.
at September. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Good evening, meeting's ended.
Good job, Rusty.
Yeah.